As someone who's very passionate about photography, I'm always eager to test every smartphone that comes out boasting something new with their cameras. And the Xiaomi 12T Pro surely caught my attention, having that 200 megapixel camera combined with beastly specs offered at an affordable price. So, let's go ahead and test out what this phone can do. In total, the 12T Pro has 3 cameras at its back: a 200 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra-wide, and the macro shooter. Rather than the usual Sony IMX sensor we see in flagship phones, Xiaomi went with a Samsung ISO-cell sensor for its main camera. To be honest, I had my doubts going into this test. I mainly thought that the 200 megapixels was more of a way for them to lure people into buying this phone. That's why I was really surprised to find out that this actually performs really well. Generally, the main camera is able to capture a great amount of detail, mainly when placed under good lighting conditions. It's a big step up, especially if you're coming from other mid-range phones. Images right out of this camera look clean, and it has the feeling of sophistication that we'd expect in more expensive phones. Coincidentally, I was doing another camera test for a budget phone while I was filming this, and while this isn't an apples-to-apples comparison, this may give you an idea as to how far the difference the 12T Pro has over a budget phone. Given that this phone has extremely fast hardware, the camera's shutter response is also very fast. You won't ever feel that the phone would get in the way of your photography. Plus, with its built-in OIS, one-handed photography is also something that you could do, and camera shake from using this with one hand would likely be eliminated. But I think where this camera really excels at is with its dynamic range. With HDR enabled, overly bright parts might not be initially seen while you take the photos, but once you snap the shot, the internal processing is able to recover that for you. Now, if I were to compare this camera from other phones in the market, I'd say this falls right in the limbo of a flagship and the mid-range category. I still won't consider this camera to be on the flagship level, and that's probably one reason why this is still more affordable than the main Xiaomi 12 series and the Xiaomi 12 Pro. Photos from this camera may look good, but it's also evident that it relies more on its internal processing, which does have the tendency to overly process the images at times. There are instances where the saturation and contrast seem a little overdone. For the ultra-wide shots, the quality does drop significantly compared to the main camera, and that's obviously because of its lower resolution. It's noticeable that the details aren't captured as much, but it is still possible to get decent-looking shots using this. I did notice that this is able to capture interesting-looking sun flares, which don't show on the main camera. As you may have noticed, this phone doesn't have a telephoto camera, but what it lacks in that department, it makes up with using the main camera's pixel resolution for zooming in, which is pretty usable, but of course, you won't get the same quality that of a dedicated telephoto. Now, just to quickly talk about the design of this phone, while I really do like its looks, it does slip out of my medium-sized hands while taking one-handed photos. There have been numerous times when I've almost had this fall off my hands, so that's something to keep in mind. But what did contribute to my experience on this is the bright Amoled display, which allowed me to see the photos I'm taking even under bright sunlight. Another aspect where this camera performs really well is for low-light photography. I've noticed that this camera is still able to capture acceptable-looking images in difficult lighting situations even when I wasn't using the dedicated night mode. Using its night mode, however, you'll notice a drastic improvement over the standard. And while it does look digitally processed and sometimes unnatural, I personally think that it has its own appeal and it's most definitely usable, especially if you're only posting it on social media. And from my personal experience, I'm really happy that I had this camera to take photos of the events during our holiday celebration. To conclude, I think the cameras of the 12T Pro still aren't on the level of its higher-end siblings. But that's far from saying that this doesn't perform well. I think for its price, combined with all other aspects, this is a great all-around phone. And I don't think that you will be disappointed. Plus, I have to admit, the 200 megapixel camera is always a great conversation starter. But what about you guys? Do you think the 200 megapixel camera on the 12T Pro is enough? I'd like to know your thoughts on this as well, so feel free to discuss this with me in the comments below. Also guys, we do have a lot of camera tests and reviews lined up, so feel free to subscribe to this channel if that's what you're into, and like this video if you found this helpful, and I will see you in the next video.